And so I'm so proud today to introduce my very good friend, Lorez Bailey, is going to moderate a panel with 3 superstars in serving frontline communities. And I'm very pleased. We have everything from Oregon to Sonoma County, good stories. So come on up, Lorez.
Thank you, Jennifer. She uses the friend so that she can always get me to do things. Anything. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'll introduce our guests and then we'll get started. So first of all, we have Jake Valentine Bentz. He is the Community Resilience Coordinator for Santiam Hospital and Clinics. Come on up, Jake. Alma Bowen, Founder and Executive Director of Nuestra Comunidad. Got to slow down. And Karym Sanchez, Executive Director of the North Bay Organizing Project. I have the pleasure of currently serving as the publisher of the North Bay Business Journal, which is a business-to-business publication, which, you know, when you think about recovery and disaster, businesses are super important to how our communities recover. And in terms of long-term planning, if we don't have a lot of essential businesses very often, it can deeply affect a community. But prior to that, I was the director of CHOP's Teen Club, and I mentioned that. They asked me to mention it because I was like, this really isn't about me. But they asked me to mention it. And one of the things that we went through in terms of being worried about fire recoveries, all the funding now became around fire. Right? Do you do art therapy? Do you do therapy in classes? Do you have yoga? And I want to say what we learned for our young people is leave us alone. Let us enjoy each other. Let us have fun. And we don't always have to talk about what's happened. We want some spaces where we don't have to talk about the impact of in our community. And then finally, I was thinking about this of like a connection. I was born and raised in the Bay Area, and we had this big firestorm in '91 that people may recall, and I just realized as I was preparing for this, every time I drive through there, I still remember. I remember my friends losing their homes. It was a very high socioeconomic area, but I still, to this day, remember that because that was soon after high school. Don't do the math, but that was soon after high school, and I just remember that firestorm, and to this day, every time I look at those mountains, I still remember it. So I just wanted to give that context and say thanks so much for having me here today. So I'd like to give my panelists an opportunity, a couple of minutes to introduce yourselves and talk about your organizations. So why don't we start here at the end with you, Jake?
Got it. Awesome. Thank you very much. As Lorez said, I am Jake Bentz with Santiam Disaster Services at Santiam Hospital and Clinics in Oregon's Santiam Canyon. Our fire was September 7th and 8th of 2020. To give you some context about the Santiam Canyon, it's a very rural area just east of Salem, the capital of Oregon, that was 400,000 acres burned across a complex fire, and so about 800 square miles of affected area. There's 5 major incorporated towns there with a population of just over 4,000-ish, and the fire destroyed 1,500 structures, and over 700 households were out of their homes. Where we come into the game is Santiam Hospital in 2017 established a program called the Service Integration Program. And in a lot of ways, like at this morning's talk, I just kept thinking over and over about how a lot of the issues we were bringing up as fire impacted communities, they're kind of not almost resolved, but integrated into our program because we were there in 2017, 3 years before our fire, almost unintentionally creating a program that was tailored perfectly to respond to such a thing. And that program, the Service Integration Program, was putting together all the community partners, stakeholders, service organizations, churches, community members who wanted to help meet unmet need in the community. And it was formulated around the school districts and the schools. And so we had 3 teams, service integration teams, set up in the school districts who had been meeting and building relationships and building that social capital, I guess, prior to the fire. And so when we had our fire, we were ready to go as far as we knew who to call in our community itself, and we knew our community best. And so with the whole myriad of folks coming in and out, federal, national, regional, state, coming in to help, we had a constant of knowing our community and knowing each other, which just, it changed the game, and it almost makes some things unrelatable, like some of the challenges. It's surprising to hear, like, for example, that someone didn't get an email list until a year and a half in of their folks, because we're so lucky to have these relationships and be the sole person offering services in that area. So that's the service integration program, which has evolved into disaster services. I came into the fold as a student who was volunteering. We evacuated from my home and was about to head down to college, actually, because it was right before September, and started volunteering at a local relief center that popped up that the hospital soon took under its wing, and volunteered for like 40 days straight with friends. And I think it's funny how we talk about those days as someone who's not a survivor of losing their home, but still was certainly there, and in the moment, it's like war, I guess. I was talking to someone, and that's kind of how we related to it, how you wax about such a fascinating, traumatic time. And so from there, I started working for the hospital. They needed help, and so I got a job managing the center, and I've done a bunch of different stuff with them since in our disaster program. And now I'm coordinating community resilience, trying to figure out what that means, imagining all of that for our program, and I'm super excited to be here today and learn from you all. So thank you.
Thank you. Karym?
Hello, everyone. My name is Karym Sanchez. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the executive director of the North Bay Organizing Project. And essentially, our mission at the North Bay Organizing Project, just gonna do that, is to build grassroots power for racial, economic, social, and environmental justice. We've been around since 2010 in Sonoma County, and we've been doing that work with frontline communities. We believe that those who are most impacted by the suffering that comes out of the result of injustice in our systems are the closest to the solutions that we want to see in the world. And NBOP is a political home for folks who have a certain set of values, right? We value the well-being of our community. We value justice in the world. And we know that in order to live those out in the public arena, you need power. So we believe that that happens in two ways: organized people and organized money. Now, the folks that we worked with, and we ourselves, we don't have a whole lot of money, but what we do have is a lot of people who share our common struggle, and who are committed to seeing that power be built in the political arena. So we're a coalition of churches, of community groups, of unions, labor, cultural groups that want to have control of our material lives around us. Thank you.
And Alma.
Hello, can you guys hear me okay? My name is Alma Bowen. I'm the founder and executive director of Nuestra Comunidad. Nuestra Comunidad means our community. We go by NC oftentimes. And prior to starting the nonprofit, my background, I was a 911 dispatcher for over 18 years. And the night of the Tubbs fire, when it hit our community, I happened to be working that night. And so what I experienced that night was unbelievable terror, unbelievable heartbreak. And as a dispatcher, for the first time, I was a communication training officer. I was a lead dispatcher. So that means that I had the responsibility that when somebody new got hired, they had to sit next to me for the first 6 months until I felt confident they could take on the job for themselves. And that night was absolutely the first time ever in my experience as a dispatcher that I heard not only myself, but my coworkers telling the community, "I'm sorry, we have nobody to send you." And these were community members that were literally running for their lives. And as our shift went on, not only were we struggling with situations that had no protocol, because we had never foreseen a fire like that to this magnitude in Sonoma County. This is the area that we work in. We also go out of the area, but that was the focus. So as dispatchers, we had to take everything we've ever learned and apply it the best that we could to get through that night. While we were at work, we had fellow coworkers losing homes. We had those of us who had left their families that didn't know exactly what was going on, even in our own homes. So it was just that kind of struggle. And I don't mention it. I know we've all gone through some sort of trauma here in this room. Whether you had lost your home or not, it's something that we all draw back from. But that night was really life-changing. I always expected to retire. I loved being a dispatcher. I loved the job. I felt like I was serving the community, but that night changed me. And so the first month, there was no room to think, at least for me. I just worked. A lot of our dispatchers were out with either mental health stuff that came up because of that night. Some lost their home, all the different situations. But the first time I started unpacking everything I learned, not only that night, but for 18 years in that job, sitting in that chair, and I decided to form a nonprofit. To be honest with you, in that moment, I didn't even know what nonprofit meant. I really didn't. I just knew that it was a way for me to serve the community and to take everything I'd learned for 18 years, including that night, and do something good and make a change. Because it felt like you either made a change or you gave in to what you felt in despair in that moment, and I didn't want to do that. So we formed NC all the way from the bottom up. My husband is my co-founder. We filed everything, did a couple things wrong. It took us almost a year to become a nonprofit. We'd never done it. At the end, we were in the game, and then we started serving the community in all phases, not only of disasters, so preparedness is our biggest focus, but response, recovery, and mitigation are also our focuses. And we do this through programs that are built through equity and that serve the community at all levels. So we want to improve the health, safety, and well-being of the community, and we do that through our programs 365 days a year, not just during fire season, not just during blue sky times, but everything in between. I'm thankful to be here, and I'm learning a lot today, so thank you.
Those were great introductions. Today we're focusing on recovery, which is addressing community needs, indigenous land practices, and mental health, but I feel like we could have multiple conversations with each of you about a whole lot of different subject areas, but I'll stay focused today. Why don't I come back your way, Jake, and if you could talk about how Santiam Health and the area that you had about addressing, what are some of those things in the immediacy that you felt that you needed to do and that you supported the community and those recovery efforts?
Yeah, again, falling back on our service integration model, we knew the community well and we knew our partners well. And so the Knights of Columbus, which is a Catholic fraternal organization out of the local Catholic churches, initially popped up, I think, day 2 after the fire. And it kind of came from a bunch of different locations, but started collecting physical donations of everything. And so that got centralized at our current site now in our donation center. And figuring out those needs, was just listening to the community and what they needed and who was coming in and what was changing. It's hard to give a strict answer just because we change things so much daily, weekly. We had a great online platform to figure out, at least for collecting donations through Sign Up Genius, which I'm glad to hear other folks use that because it is awesome. In figuring out how, getting to the community who wasn't necessarily affected, what do we need here at the center, whether it's box fans or water or extension cords or tarps, because the rain's going to come in 2 weeks, right? So listening to the community through our center and getting it there. And we were so lucky with physical location of having a donation center like 5 steps away from our case management office because the county moved a modular trailer into our parking lot. So I think that's something big that I don't think about a lot. That was super helpful, was just being right next to each other. And yeah.
Well, I think part of what makes this work special and hard, depending on the community, right, that work and how it looks can differ, because what you've talked a lot about is we need to meet people where they are. And if you meet people where they are, then you don't necessarily determine what that looks like. You have to get to that community and figure out what they need in the immediate and long term. Karym, we talked about some, short-term things, but we got a little bit into the Undaki Fund and how that, I thought, and I'll let you get into that, I thought that maybe that had happened longer along this recovery journey, but you made it very clear to me this is something that came very early in the work. So you want to talk a little bit about one, looking at those systems and even how you were talking about making sure there was people to be at the evacuation centers, but also how the Undaki Fund grew out of that work.
Yeah, thank you. So North Bay Organizing Project, we have a long history of working with the immigrant community in Sonoma County. We were actually born out of the day labor struggle over in Grayton and the Grayton Day Labor Center. And so we had a lot of relationships, like you were speaking about, that are so important to have. And what we were hearing when the first fires in 2017 is, one, that folks weren't getting information in their language, which was absolutely critical information that folks needed to receive in an accessible way. And we were also hearing about people's hesitancy to go to the evacuation centers. A lot of folks who were undocumented were actually going over to the coast because they weren't sure if it was safe for them, given their status, to go to an evacuation center. And then what we were also hearing is that the undocumented community was being left out of recovery efforts because they couldn't apply for any federal assistance to deal with all the expense that came from evacuating and losing their homes. And so we were one of the co-founding organizations of UndocuFund, which was and the first of its kind since we created it in 2017. There's been UndocuFunds that have come up all over the nation. And there was actually just a summit that ended today with all these UndocuFunds that came together. And so we did what we know how to do best as community, as a resilient community, which is help each other out. How do we show up for one another? How do we provide this mutual aid? But what's important for us at NBOP is that we don't only figure out how do we show up for one another, how could we provide services for one another, but how do we do that in a way that highlights the injustice and the inequity that's been there all along, that the fires and these crises only heightened, right? Because the reality is that the solution is not in how do we figure out a way for philanthropy to give money to undocumented folks and all of us to pat ourselves on the back and act like we did a great job. The reality is, how do we address this unjust immigration system in our country that's creating this suffering in the first place, right? So that's one of the things that's really important to us.
Alma, people probably think you were in some ways more prepared for this as a 911, operator, but that's a very unique place in itself. But can you talk about also about how out of this disaster happened, you built this nonprofit, but now what you did at the time, early on, and where you're now in terms of this long-term recovery process. One of the things that I talked to them about, when you go through disasters, it kind of reminds me when you have a loss in your family, right? Those first couple of weeks, people bring you cakes, they bring you food, they make calls, they check on you, and then time goes, life goes on, and people tend to forget. And if it's not front in your media or you're not living it directly, you can forget and separate. And so that's why when we talk about this work, right, it's not just the short term, it's the long term. So if you could talk about some of the things that you did in the immediate reaction, but now where your organization has grown to in terms of supporting the recovery process.
Absolutely. So in 2017 was when I was dispatching. So the next year I became a nonprofit. For the whole year it took us that. But during the meantime, I already started doing the work. So I went out, I was going into schools, community groups everywhere, speaking about disaster preparedness. I was flying out to all areas of the country, taking trainings through FEMA and anywhere there was disaster preparedness or anything relevant, so I could educate myself to develop these programs. And then I also started building relationships with all stakeholders, because I knew this wasn't going to be a one-way avenue, that there was going to have to be a lot of partners in a lot of different things. So I reached out to community groups, community leaders, promotores that already existed. That's a no-brainer. Every community, for all of you guys, no matter where you're from, there are already community leaders within your communities. If you can find them, identify them, and empower them with your message and bring them along, they can do more work than any of us could ever do alone. So you already have those resources out there. I started tapping into that, forming relationship with local employers that had really big workforces so that I can have access to many of the workers. A lot of the work, as you saw from the slides, talk about meeting people where they're at. I'm in vineyards, I'm in fields, I'm in hotel, little rooms that they give me to talk to people as they're switching out shifts. It doesn't matter where I'm invited to come out to focus our program. So we did all that. We built a nonprofit. We started doing the work. I had to resign my position as a dispatcher because what I found is almost immediately as I started meeting with government officials, with local entities and telling them what I wanted to do and what the programs I had envisioned, when we came on the scene, we did 911 awareness and we did disaster preparedness. Those were our two biggest focuses. In all of that, then come 2019, we're just getting on the scene, right? 2019, February, I resigned my position as a dispatcher. Kincaid fire hits. All of a sudden, something I hadn't foreseen was becoming part of the response. I had the unique experience while I was a dispatcher. I was also a medical interpreter for the largest trauma center here in Sonoma County Memorial Hospital. So I'd had formal interpreter training. When we upped the evacuation center in Hillsburg during Kincaid fire, they asked me to come in and organize volunteers and be the communication component of it. So we worked hand in hand with the American Red Cross in our center so that we can bring so we can make it a place that welcomed 99% of the people affected in that fire in the North County were vineyard agricultural workers with mixed document status families. We didn't want them to be afraid like in 2017 and not show up at the evacuation center. So we formed a coalition. You guys were involved. A lot of local nonprofits that worked with those communities were the first faces they saw when they walked in. And then the word gets out and people feel like, okay, this is safe. These are all organizations that we trust. When you become a trusted messenger, they're going to feel safe around something if you tell them. They know you. They know your work you're doing. So anyway, that was the first evacuation center where people showed up. We had over 250 people staying there, and only 3 were non-Latino people. So, that worked. But then that evacuation center had to be evacuated. But as a nonprofit, we grew into the response part of it. And so I didn't foresee that role, but we were well equipped. So we developed programs around that. And we now have a disaster ready interpreter program where we put people through formal training with the same lady that I learned to interpret from. We developed a program specific because what I was noticing at evacuation centers is you function with volunteers, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's also an ethical component to language justice, and that is that an interpreter needs to know the job as an interpreter and the ethical component of it, and we weren't seeing that. And I was concerned for that because I was seeing some inaccurate interpreting where the person's voice was not their own anymore, they were changing it. And so I was concerned about that, so we developed a program. So that's how we function, as we see the need and we meet the need by talking to community. We have a community advisory board that meets every month. They give us feedback. We have feedback loops. We do surveys with all of our program participants. So we're hearing their voice constantly, and that informs us. So when I think about equity, it's not just the language component or the racial component. It could be seniors, it could be socioeconomic, it could just be access. And so we try to cover all those bases. So now we have 2 offices. We service all of Sonoma County. We're called out of the area sometimes, 5 full-time employees and 6 contractors later. And so, we're still growing, but we want to grow at the speed of trust. We want to grow as the community shows us that they want to engage and grow with us.
I think it's always important, right, to have that perspective of looking back and always be able to say, I wish I knew, then what I know now. I'm sure you all have that experience. So I'd kind of like to know, what would you say to yourself, 3 years ago, if you could have said that, or how many years your emergency was, what would you say to yourself? But really, I guess I'm essentially asking you, what have you learned in this time? So, Karym, I'll start with you, and then go to Jake, and then we'll come on to Alma. What have you learned?
Yeah, I think the biggest lesson that we were reminded of is that it's this notion of inequity existing in different arenas in our lives, right? And especially like in recovery. Not everybody recovered the same. When we talk about meeting people where they're at, I keep thinking of the folks that we talk to on a day-to-day basis. Like renters didn't recover the same as homeowners might have, right? Folks from mixed status families didn't recover the same as others. When we talk about I think oftentimes when we talk about like the Fountain Grove area, that's a very wealthy area. That was impacted, and the folks who were impacted who lost their homes, sometimes we leave out of the conversation the people who cleaned their homes, the folks who were mowing those lawns and were manicuring their bushes, who also saw an economic impact, and that part of the recovery wasn't necessarily addressed. So I think that's the biggest thing that we continue to be reminded of, that it's not just for us how do we work with specific demographics, but like recognizing that there's a lot of things that intersect to make up our identities, and that all creates barriers. So yeah, reminding ourselves of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it makes me think about a lot of stuff. We've learned a lot of tough lessons in equity as it relates to housing status and homeowner versus renter versus other. I'll start specifically, something that a colleague and I are working on right now is, you could call it a case study about some different communities within our region who did not fit into the box of homeowner or renter. And we follow that because as a disaster case management program, our guidelines kind of trickle down from FEMA through our contractor at the national level and then to us. And those are the two boxes we have on the paper in the intake interview. And so an example of one of those communities that never fit in and is the Brighton Bush Hot Springs community. There's a resort, hot springs, remotely, furthest away from us you can get up the canyon, and it's a workers-owned co-op. And so trying to figure out, okay, my name's not on the property deed, but I do own it because I work here and their staff housing was destroyed. And so, and looking at the other benefits of that, right? They're not just providing housing to folks in the area, they're providing an intrinsic good of a service that brings in all sorts of things to the area, economic good. Folks from all over the world come to this place. And even though they got recognized by the state, that we asked the question, can we register some of these folks? We finally got an okay. It was 10 months down the line before that was a firm yes, and 10 months later, the folks have packed up and gone. And when you lose people from the area, you lose so much more than just numbers in the workforce. You lose knowledge, you lose trust, you lose everything. So learning a lot of lessons about how that might be addressed differently in the future. I'd love to talk to somebody up the food chain about how that works. I don't know enough about it. But then more broadly, learning that learning is really hard sometimes, and that I think we took it as a given after a certain point that even though we've figured out a way to do something and it works, it's probably going to come down the line that we have to do it a different way in 6 weeks. It's specific to disaster case management and just feeling like the rug's pulling out from us every month or two. I'm seeing some nods. Yes, it's common. It's common in case management, especially when there was no playbook for us until day one after the fires, and we're still getting pieces of the playbook every week 2 years in. And we're starting to take things in stride better in 2 years. I'm proud to say that. But yeah, just taking lessons of learning is hard, and a lot of specific equity stuff.
For me, the learning came into separate kind of arenas. On a personal level, I had to learn how to be uncomfortable and be okay with that. I was not seeing nonprofit world to be so political and so complicated in some respects. I was a dispatcher behind a phone for 20 years, so I didn't have to look at people. And so going into a world where I was put in uncomfortable situations where I had to be outside of my comfort zone, speaking in public. When I first started all of this, I literally felt like I was going to be sick every single time. And now I just embrace it, you know? I still feel like that for maybe 60 seconds, and I learned from a public speaking seminar I took that that's normal. But I had to grow. I had to grow, and I had to learn and actually study and, you know, get into topics and just really understand even how I feel, how I think. And I've learned more about my own culture than I could have ever imagined. I came here as a child, as an immigrant. And so I grew up here and lost a lot of my own identity because my parents were busy trying to raise us. And so they, you know, I relate to a lot of like what we serve. But as working in the community, I am now the daughter of many moms. I am now the sister of many sisters, and they have taken me under their wing and just really helped me find who I was. So finding my own voice was something that I learned through this process. On a nonprofit level, on a professional level, I learned the value of relationships in general. Relationships with community, relationships with other agencies, with partners, with government figures, with everybody. Like, those relationships could be so key, and they can really facilitate growth and change. So now I'm able to use those relationships to continue to advocate for change, the change that, you know, I know is necessary, but also within my programs, I'm able to use those relationships to grow more leaders in the community. And that's something that's been amazing. I never knew the value of relationships before to this extent. It can move a lot of things. So harness the ones you have in your area.
Even the people you don't like. That's what I've heard. That's what I've heard. You know, one of the things I had when we were preparing for this, one of the things that we talked about, it felt like years past when a disaster, major disaster hit a community, people said, where's the government? Where's the help? They're supposed to be taking care of us. And one thing that you all talked about, darn it, Jake, it's even in your title, is resiliency. And what does being resilient or building resiliency, or what does that word mean to each of you and in terms of this work and in your organization? So I want to give you an opportunity once again to elevate that word resilient and how to help people be resilient in the face of really deep challenges, right? And that's part of that, meeting people where they are. So let's talk about resiliency. What does it mean to you? Try to mix it up.
Yeah, it's actually a really funny question for me. For like the past 2 years, I've been like answering that with a cop-out, like, oh, resilience, what does it mean, right? And I think it's because there's so many different definitions of it. And we're so quick, I feel like, from the wildfire recovery world to focus on like economic resilience of physical structures. But what I really learned a lot about from the last 2 years, and it's just coming up in like every sentence, is social resiliency as far as the relationships and the collaboration. And it just seems so obvious to me now. It was something I never even thought about before our fire, was just how important it was that we knew each other in our community and that we knew our community. And moving forward, figuring out how we do that more. Super funny, on the plane down here, I sat next to someone and we got to talking, and she was the one house out of 8 on her block that didn't burn in Santa Rosa a few years ago. I'm not sure what fire it was. But she talked to me about the relationships she had built with her neighbors before and after the fire. And I was like, thank you so much. I'm just trying to figure out how we do this in the Santiam Canyon with everybody, because these relationships and this safety net you have. I mean, she was 92 years old and she had people checking on her all the time when there's a 2.1 earthquake, right? It's just incredible stuff. People are incredible, but figuring out how to give them the tools to do that more easily and to encourage it is what we're trying to figure out. So resilience, right? What does it mean?
Yeah, I think for me, what comes up with resiliency is the ability to bounce back from something, right? When something is happening to you, being able to come back from that, and the moments that I've been resilient, I think it's been expressed a lot that it doesn't always feel good when you're being resilient. But I think back, like every time that I've come back from something, I come back all the wiser, right? I'm not the same. There's usually something that builds me up, right? What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, kind of idea. But what I really think about is the opportunity for transformation there, right? When we're being resilient, what's the opportunity for transformation? Not only transformation, like when I was hearing your story, like I was picturing the transformation that was happening to you personally. And I'm a firm believer that as we're being transformed as people, there's also an opportunity to transform the systems around us and ask some critical questions like, what would it look like for us to truly implement language justice, right? What would it really look like for us to be equitable in our responses? I think that too often it's hard for us to imagine because we're so tied to what the dominant narrative of what's supposed to be, like we're supposed to, I don't think anybody is interested in getting back to normal, right? We want to see a new world at the end of all of this. And so that's where my head goes. As I'm building up this resiliency, what's the opportunity there to transform as a person and the systems around me?
I'm a very literal thinker in some aspects. So when I think about resilience, I believe like the formal definition is something like, how do you survive, bounce back and recover and bounce back from an event? And so for me, when I'm looking at it through the lens of our nonprofit, I always think of bounce back or, get back to your life. And so we focus on like the everyday life. So programs that teach about rental assistance, working with youth all the way from kindergarten all the way through high school, creating leadership, making sure that the life that they're bouncing back to has all those tools and components and knowledge so that they can get back to it, a baseline. We're not talking about right now, because to me there is no baseline for some of the families. They're always in the same mode that we go into during disaster, barely surviving every day, fighting every day for just, to keep a roof over their head and things like that. So how do we create resilience? I believe by improving the everyday situation so that when they go into disaster mode, they're better equipped with knowledge and resources. And then that way they can take that upon themselves. I did a research project with a student from Stanford, and through this project we found that most Latino communities, and it was across the board, it was also BIPOC communities, it was senior citizens, have maybe $400 of reserve money. And that if anything happened, not only a disaster, but let's say they get laid off or they're sick and don't get paid, they only had $400. So how do we improve that so that they have more money set away, not only for a disaster, but anything that can impact their family? That's how we create resilient communities, the ones that have the resources at their fingertips and that they could administer when they know. They know better than we know when they need that.
I think all of you have addressed this, but I think it's super important to call out and give intentionality. How do you have that equitable lens or that equitable intentionality around the work that you do? We all talked about that it's not just race, it's age, your seniors, people with disabilities, socioeconomic. There's a lot of levels to having an equitable viewpoint or trying to provide services. So I want to come back and give you a chance, because I think little by little you've talked about it, but give it some intentional time to address. It seems like you're ready to go.
Yeah. I have something. All right. I think part of it is acknowledging that everybody has something to teach. Like everybody carries some type of wisdom. And I know that there's a lot of value to, like institutional knowledge, right? That I think a lot of folks, I don't know, there might be a lot of folks in this room who go to school for a lot of years and you get expertise in something, and that's valuable. But I also think that there's a lot of value in looking at organic intellectuals, individuals. I think a big conversation that is happening now, thank you, is going back to traditional ecological knowledge. I do think that there are other ways to develop knowledge and to look at what people have to teach us. I did a lot of work with folks with developmental or intellectual disabilities, and I learned a lot about patience, working with folks with different abilities. In working with folks who have years of working with the soil back in their homelands, have a lot that that they contribute to growing vineyards here and taking care of the land here. And so I think that it's important to recognize that folks that grow up or that may develop their intellect outside of institutions are just as valuable, and we have something to learn.
Sure. I think one of the biggest approaches that we take that really speaks to equity is that through our processes, we bring in partners at every phase of a process. We don't simply present to them like a new program and go, ta-da, here we go, check mark, you approved it or you think it's good. We literally bring them in as full-on partners. In our community action board, advisory board that we have, we take suggestions and we actually implement them. So we don't just fill a room with people to give us opinions and then we do nothing with it. They become true partners. And I think in equity, giving people a voice, acknowledging what they bring. There have been events that we are organizing as an organization that we have community leaders that come in and say, hey, you're doing it all wrong. Can I help you? And we're not the one to say, no, we got this. Well, sure. And we have, the events come out to be way better than we could have ever done it if we just wanted to do it our way. So recognizing, like you said so clearly, the talent, the knowledge that's already out there, and being willing to learn as well as, bring whatever you have. And so that's the biggest way for equity. And then working within those groups. We're in mobile home parks with seniors. We're in senior complexes. We get invited to different social groups to do presentations. We're out there and then we ask them. And then lately we've been really involved with homeless veterans and veterans that have struggled. And so learning what their needs are, what their perspectives are, and really taking those things into account. There's nothing that beats being boots on the ground and really being out in community as far as being equitable goes. It's not institutional knowledge, it's learning the community itself that you serve, and it could be different in any time. I was asked to go to Alabama. I know nothing about Alabama. I really didn't, but I was also humble enough to get out there and be able to say, I got the stats, I read up on all of this, but tell me tell me. And then taking what I'm learning and really implementing that.
No, I totally agree with both of you. I think the one thing I'll add is, for us specifically, is having folks who lost homes working in the program and having their voices elevated because, again, at the end of the day, it's their lived experience. And I can be as close as I can to that, but I can never get that. And just going off of that same idea that, no matter what you've been through, who you are, you have something to contribute to these discussions. And again, being, the cliche, boots on the ground, I cannot agree with that more. It's one thing to have the opinion at the table, or the perspective, but to actually understand it and to actually walk the property as someone who lost their home, or in other examples, doing other things. It's very, very powerful, and you don't get that insight from anywhere else. So,
thank you. We have a couple of minutes left, and I think it's important. We've talked about how critical this work is, how it looks, what it can look like, but we really haven't talked about what it's your experience to have to be the people that provide this service, right? What about your mental health? How do you take in so much and still continue to do this work day after day after day, hearing the stories and experiences and being the boots on the ground? Because also, right, it's very easy to be somewhere in an office and make a decision, but when you see it and you're those boots on the ground, that's got to have some impact on you also. So we don't have a lot of time, but I'd love if anybody would like to just talk about that self-care or how you maintain your own mental health around, a lot of difficult conversations and experiences.
I would love to share, because I think as a small team, we're, a team. I always say we're small but mighty. There's only 5 of us, and one's an admin person. So as an executive director, I often get it from other executive directors. Why are you always out at outreach, or why are you at your own events? It's, first of all, what drives me. I love being in community, but also that's what keeps me grounded. But it's also what breeds a culture within our staff to take care of yourself. And so I tell my team all the time, because sometimes, and during COVID especially, we had very difficult situations with families that we were helping to different degrees that were horrifying, and they were heartbreaking. And so I connected to a local mental health professional and said, if we need it, can you come in and counsel us? And so I provided that to all of my team, and then to myself, because there was times we would walk away from what we were doing and get to the office and just cry together, and then allowing that space to feel, it'd be okay for you to feel, to voice and to support each other. It's a culture in our organization. There's no day where you have to act like you're okay if you're not. You know, if you're not okay, we want to hear about it, and we'll get you whatever support you need. So I think making it okay and acknowledging that it is hard is really important.
Jake and Karym, did you have anything else to add?
I think for me, is remembering, or the way I take care of myself is remembering that whatever individual task or case we might be working with, that it's a part of something bigger than what's happening. There's a greater calling here, right? That's bigger than me, that's anybody. And so what drives me, or what fuels me to continue, is my faith in people, my faith in community, this process of community coming together and acting as a collective. When we center the well-being of our community, I have faith that another world is possible, and we can create it when we come together.
Jake, you have anything to add?
No.
Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for your attention.